Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first webinar in our spring series on organizing your writing from first draft to publishing. And today's webinar is conducting and constructing a literature review for maximum impact. So with that, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Stacy Penna, the Engagement and Enablement Director here at Lumivero. I've been with the company for many years, and now I'm in charge, and I have a team working with our communities, which is great. So part of the community is this webinar series. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Robert Thomas is a lecturer in marketing and strategy at Cardiff Business School at Cardiff University, a fellow at the Chartered Institute of Marketing, and a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce, and fellow of Higher Education Academy. His research has appeared in international peer-reviewed journals, including European Journal of Marketing, Journal of Business Ethics, Computers and Human Behavior, Journal of Macro Marketing, and Journal of Marketing Management, plus qualitative market research. So welcome, Robert. We're excited to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so firstly, thank you very much, Stacey. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to colleagues from around the world, students, postgrads, undergrads, and so on. So it's a lovely, rare opportunity to do that. So yes, and thank you very much for those of you who've turned up. I'm again very grateful. So it's a great opportunity to do this. So today, I know I'm going to be speaking to you for around 40-45 minutes. I will do my level best to ensure that I answer your questions as thoroughly as I possibly can, but there is a designated time at the end. So again, I will certainly try my best in what is a limited time. So I'm going to start, if that's okay with everybody. Everybody's comfortable. So I'm going to provide today a brief synopsis and overview of the literature review process. Not in terms of how to write one, although we are touching upon that, but what we look for as academics, as reviewers, as mentors, and indeed as your lecturers, to ensure that you are maximizing the opportunity to present your work, to actually enter the debate in and around your work, and ensure that you are actually meeting the highest academic standards. A literature review is a much maligned part of the research process. I think there's a huge concentration on data capture, and then obviously the quote unquote contributions, but this really is the major structural pillar of your work. I cannot state that more emphatically. This really is the central pillar of what you do. This will change the perception of your work. It'll enhance every solitary chapter of your work. It'll enhance your research question, and it'll ensure that the perception of your work, if it is done well, will be enhanced dramatically. Okay. So any questions at this point?
No, I'll let you know. I think people are just doing
wonderful. Sorry, my apologies. Thank you.
No, you're okay.
So I just wanted to start with some good news. This may or may not be something that you're aware of, but when we come to write a literature review, you don't have to have any special skills. You don't have to be a seasoned academic. You don't have to be ultra intelligent. What you have to have is a dedication and a willingness to read, make notes, and then go back in and analyze that into its purest, simplest form. Everybody can do that. If you've been through the educational system, you can read, you can write, you can converse, you can generate an argument. You can very much do that within an academic framework as well. But before we start, the good news is you don't have to be a magician. You don't have to be a wizard. You certainly don't have to be Benedict Cumberbatch to be able to provide or create something that is quite significant. An ability to locate journal articles and books, and an ability to read, and an ability to create notes. That's all you will need to be successful at this early juncture. Okay, so I don't know if that's good news. I sincerely hope that it is. I was a student myself a long time ago, and it really is a question of immersing yourself in this. You don't have to have a special ability. But the other piece of good news as well, and I sincerely hope this is good news for you, when we come to a literature review, everything that you will need to read and fundamentally write and then present has already been written. You are under no obligation to write anything new. All you will do is frame what is currently known, what is currently debated, and what supports your research question, and contextualize that against the backdrop of your research, broad research framework. So you are under no onus to reconceptualize, rethink, reposit, recreate theoretical ideas, arguments, or anything of that nature. Okay, so nothing at all. And that's the absolute joy of doing something like this. The argument that you need to present exists. It fundamentally exists in what has gone before. None of us have the ability to look into the future to understand what may or may not happen in a theoretical area, but we certainly have the capacity to read up to this current point in 2023, what has affected, what has impacted, and what the contributions have been within our given area. Okay, so no need to revolutionize theory, no need to contribute to theory. You are presenting a pre-existing argument, and you are presenting that against the backdrop of your work. So a review is not a fictional process. It is based on pre-existing academic facts, ideas, and theories. And one of the easiest ways to start establishing what they are is to find out who the most cited authors are in your area. It's a surefire way of engaging and absolutely unequivocally ensuring you have that contemporary and what we call historical or chronological element to what you're doing. So I do hope that that's good news for you. It was certainly good news when the penny dropped with me as a much, much younger man 30 years ago. And it is something that has stuck with me for the duration of my academic career, but I don't need to do anything new. But with regard to reading, obviously journals are key to understanding the available literature. Lots of students, in my experience, don't necessarily have a method for reading, a method for note-taking, and ensuring that what they are reading is captured and synthesized and disaggregated and reduced down to what it means to you and the work. But many of you may be familiar with this, but I will touch upon it briefly. I encourage all of my students to use the Cornell note-taking system. It was created back in the 1950s, but it is a superb way of reading and collating information. You can actually get an app for this as well, so you don't have to have the tried and tested method of scribbling things down. But we break our page up into different sections, where we have one section which captures your thoughts, reflections, ideas, and those momentary ideas that may arise as you're reading. We also then break up our page to ensure that we are taking enough notes, capturing things like authors, time frames, methodological ideas, chronological frameworks, more importantly, critiques within those frameworks. And what you will find after 3 or 4 readings, you're starting to develop a significant schema of what is known in your area and how you can then start to present that. Okay, but it is important when you're reading a journal, you read it in its entirety. There will be aspects that you don't understand. When I read journals, there are lots of things that I don't understand. That's the joy of this process. But taking these notes, having a definitive depository of what you have read and what you are about to read is critical for writing the report, writing your literature review. So again, I sincerely hope you download the app or indeed get some A4 paper and a pen and start implementing this. I cannot recommend it enough, and it's something I do this as a very cynical old man these days. I do it constantly, so I really hope that's of benefit to you. So some tips there, but the reason we're doing this today is that the literature review, as I said in my sort of initial element with you, it is unequivocally the most important thing that you will write in context. And for us as markers, as academics, as mentors, and as it says here, a poorly conceived or poorly written literature review will unequivocally have a detrimental effect on the whole work, because this is where you are able to develop your linguistic skills, your metacognitive skills, demonstrate a breadth of reading, and demonstrate that you have the ability to engage in argument and present argument. But more importantly, a well-written review, as I said earlier, will permeate all of the other sections that you invariably collate. And that's good news. The ability to go back to a depository like a literature review, understand who said what they asked, using what sample, what type of participants in what context, and knowing what they found out makes the method easier, it makes your analysis easier, and make writing of managerial implications easier, or whatever it might be in the context of your particular discipline. So regardless of discipline, if you are engaged in primary research, this is the most important facet of what you're doing, because this is the core and the brain of the whole piece of work. Boot-and-Belly's work is absolutely essential. What if the literature review is created poorly, and the most important thing, there's no argumentation, we presume that the piece of work is biased, the piece of work lacks any balance, and subsequently we start to believe that we may be reading a polemic, we may be reading something that doesn't offer an academic scope and is ultimately subjective. The moment that those perceptions kick in, we have issues, and I'm sure lots of academics would say that. So the perception of the quality of the work is palpable and explicit within the literature review. Do not save your best writing or your best work for your findings or possible contribution. It all starts in this particular chapter. So when your review is the most in chapter, because I've just sort of cut across that. But again, it's a chance for you to embrace and to become part of the argument. But more importantly, and at a base level, it's about your capacity to clearly and indicatively suggest that you are informed. Okay, so what we want, an informed literature review normally reflects some blood, sweat, and tears. That is the truth of the matter. And if you are contributing to that perception of what it should be, and we can see that, particularly the element of argumentation, you are going a long way to ensuring success. So as I've got on my final element there, a good review will enhance the credibility of your whole research. The time spent using the Cornell system ensures that you are working up to a standard. We see detail, we see depth, we see breadth. And again, I keep using the word argument. It's one of the most important things we look for when we're evaluating a literature review. Argumentation, so keep that as your top of mind recall. When you start to write, the onus is to create a critical argument that supports and also suggests there are weaknesses in your work. So some of the basics then. So your report, for me, the most important things are your report should be a critical review of the relevant literature. Critical basically means you do not present a one-sided piece of work that fails to acknowledge other viewpoints, standpoints, theories, and inflections from others that critique what you are doing. The ability to bring that into your writing will enhance your grade tremendously. And invariably, when we are talking about undergraduates, perhaps postgraduates at master's level, there is an emphasis on grades that we cannot get away from. So by doing that, you will enhance your grade tremendously. Okay. We also then want you to identify potential gaps. Now, gaps are not an essential element at undergraduate or at M level. But naturally, if you are writing at perhaps a PhD level, I don't know if there's anybody on the call who falls into that categorization, but you do need to identify gaps. You need to identify that there is a fundamental gap in our knowledge, and there isn't that dearth of information available to us. Okay, the two key takeaways at this early stage are criticality and argumentation. But the other element as well is you need to be able to demonstrate a significant affiliation and synergy with your field of research. So by doing that, it's the breadth of reading, it's the citations, it's the acknowledgement of who the major authors are, the major theories and the major contributions. Those normally align in epochs over time. So that's something when you start writing, make sure that you know who the major authors are in your area. And reading some contemporary work, perhaps that's even been published in 2023, even a cursory evaluation of 2 to 3 papers, you'll start to see the same names appearing regularly. That then should be your starting point for boring down into what is known. So this is just a basic idea then of what you need to do in a literature review. I won't go through them all, but of course, all of these need to be addressed, okay? All of them need to be addressed. But synthesizing and gaining a new perspective is something that often throws writers. The new perspective is the context of your work. You're utilizing the theory to underpin the rationale and the necessity of your work. That's what we mean by synthesizing and gaining a new perspective. You are forming the literature around your research idea. Again, nothing new, so don't worry about the notion of new perspective. The newness is that it's being applied to your context. Okay, so the other element that we look for, and I've touched upon this, and if you go down to the bottom, identifying methodologies and techniques that have been used, the literature review, as well as framing the current and contemporary literature to support your argument, needs to start building the argument for your method and your methodological choices. So understanding what others have done, the successes they've had, or indeed the failures, is a significant part of enhancing your literature review. And the more that you can argue for that within the context of the literature review, the stronger the perception of your method is going forward. So I come back to that salient point. This is a significant structural pillar that will actually provide a significant basis for your method and your methodology. So do not think of this particular element of your work as a solitary construct. So what you need to do then in terms of demonstrating your ability. So making informed decisions, by that we simply mean getting the right journals, okay? Don't go down any rabbit holes, focus, focus, focus. And we have something called the funnel approach. Your work will start in a broad sense and it will be narrowed down to your content, okay? You must spend time reading and ultimately being able to summarize other people's work. Absolutely critical. If you need to practice paraphrasing, I strongly suggest you do. A literature review that relies on constant direct quotes ceases to be a literature review. It is just a succession of ideas that others have posited. So do get used to summarizing work, and that's where the Cornell system actually comes into it. So we want you to engage in a historical and contemporary element to make sure the breadth of reading is there. And again, I won't go on too much, but the criticality. So when we finish today, you can go back and see what is needed. What I tend to ask my students to do is every time they put pen to paper is to see if they can tick that particular box on a given session to ensure that they are conforming to the highest academic standards. And I would encourage you to do the same. So a basic overview of the mistakes that lots and lots of people make, including myself over the years. I'm not going to be a hypocrite. You know, when we start the academic process, it's quite hard to get all the requisite skills together. So do not use a review to prove what you believe. If you write subjectively first person with a strong emphasis on one element of an argument, you're destined to fail. I don't want to be negative, but that is the truth, okay? Description, not good. We want detail. Good marks, and the devil will be in the detail. Detail will come from your ability to synthesize and summarize other people's works, okay? Do not rely on books. It's an easy thing to do to rely on academic books. There's nothing wrong with them. They're wonderful things, and I have written them myself. I'm sure there's somebody out there who's actually read them. But books really are just a stepping stone to getting into the empirical data associated with your area and capitalizing on the journals. For those of you who are unfamiliar with journals, there may be some journals invariably have rankings, 4 to 1, 4 being, or 4-star being the best, 1 being something that has a moderate contribution. Everything you will need will be in that. For those of you who are doing business, which is my area, we have something called the ABS list. Download that and start looking at the journals that support your area, okay? So don't rely on 1 or 2 papers to inform your work. I'm situated here in South Wales. We have a wonderful Welsh philosopher called Bertrand Russell, and he was very keen to say, beware of the person of one book. So we want that depth of reading. And more importantly then, in terms of the mistakes, you do not provide a breadth of opinions. A breadth of opinions is absolutely essential. This sounds crass, but nobody is ultimately interested in what you believe. They are interested in your ability to present a well-honed, constructed and balanced argument. Okay, that's the essence of it. To avoid all of the first person element. And one thing that always gets overlooked is the creating a bibliography as you go along. When I did my PhD, through stresses and strains, I neglected to do that. My wife had to take 2 weeks off work, which is a true story, to ensure that we went through my work with a tooth comb to find missing references. That aged me by about 25 years, so don't do that, okay? So hopefully you're finding this beneficial and I'm not going on too much. So one of the things we have that I'm looking at my screen here, this is a standard kind of funnel approach for engaging and creating a good, robust academic literature review. Your introduction will be a broad theoretical understanding of where you are, conceptualizations of the main elements you're looking at. And as we progress with the view, we bore more and more and more down into theory. And the last thing I should be reading is about your main theoretical base. What are the primary 1 or 2 theories that fundamentally drive your research, and what do we know about them? So we start broad and we are perpetually narrowing. But the good news is, if you are reading, every single peer-assessed literature review that you will read will invariably conform to this particular framework. We start with conceptualizations. We present a broad analysis of our main theoretical areas. We bore down into those theoretical areas, and then we ostensibly summarize in our conclusion. Okay? Your story starts quite fat and robust, corpulent, and then we redact and redact and reduce and reduce and reduce and reduce. So before we go into the method section in a review, the last things we are reading really is a reiteration of your research question and a summation of the major theories that drive what you're about to explore. Okay, so I do hope that makes sense. Keep this model to hand once you start writing. It's critically important, okay? But within that framework, one of the biggest mistakes is when students say, right, I've got the structure, I've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's all great. I said, yes, you have got a beginning and a middle and an end, but what is the central theme that guides me through this labyrinth of words? What is the central story? And I say to my students, when I read reviews, this might sound like an odd sort of metaphor. I treat it as a bank of coal. It's all black, and I'm looking for the little bits of silver that guide me through that give me that indication of what is going on. When you're writing, you're guiding both yourself initially and then the reader through this labyrinth of words. You have to find a definitive trail through it to ensure that whoever's marking it, reading it, understands it, can disseminate it, and understand its worth, and they don't get bogged down in trying to find out or establish what you've written, okay? So the labyrinth metaphor, you may think, oh, what's this guy going on about? But you're leading people through a maze of ideas, concept, theories, and so on and so forth. And what we want as markers is the ability for you to do that for us, because we're all academics are lazy. So before we start getting into some of the dynamics of it, I just want to touch upon the types of review that you might expect, or the types of review that you may end up having to write. I hope that's okay, just a few minutes. So we have something called a systematic review. Now, a systematic review is when you have been given a well-refined and well-defined research question, and you are using a system of pre-selecting what type of ideas, theories, and papers will go into that. Fantastic if you're engaging in a broad evaluation of a distinct area, or you're trying to establish what has been found out intrinsically in one certain gap within that field. So you arguably will not have to do a systematic literature review depending on your level of study, but some of the basic elements of this, which is the concentration of literature, is a lesson that you can take forward into writing what we call an integrative literature review, which is what I'm going to touch upon for the moment. So systematic literature review is a review that has an established criteria, a very deductive, a very distinct line of questioning within it, where most literature reviews are an evaluation of a broad sense of ideas. So the characteristics predetermined, incredibly focused, and tries to establish a common truth, wherever that may be. So we attempt to find everything that is known about one solitary idea. Pray that you never have to do that. I have had to do it, and it's no fun at all. Okay, so no fun at all. No fun at all. I shall say no more. But we then have something called a chronological literature review. This is where we use history, chronology, history, to map out a distinct idea. Again, very, very, very specialist, very rare, to be honest, but what you will have to do in an integrative review is borrow from this chronological idea. We want to see the history and the seminal points that lead up to 2023 in your work. We need to understand the trends, not all of them, the major contributors, not all of them, and what has been found out, but not in its entirety. But taking from these chronological aspects is very, very important. It demonstrates a breadth of reading, and the reader understands the importance of the area you're working in. Okay, so it's a broader approach. So I've got Karl Marx and Adam Smith here, the fathers of modern communism and socialism. Adam Smith are the modern father of capitalism. So if I wanted to map that, if I wanted to map capitalism, I would start with Adam Smith. That would be my starting point, and I would work through the developments of that framework as we go along. And I probably got a slightly more frivolous element here about Batman. Okay, if we went from the first Batman films with Burt Ward to Robert Pattinson, you would be able to map the evolution of the character, the dialogue, the individuals, the metaphors, the major themes, and so on and so forth. Very, very interesting, and a great way of mapping, as I've got there, the evolution of ideas. You will need to do that in your framework. Okay. So moving on, if my mouse works. So what you will arguably avoid, and I would encourage you to avoid this unless it's part of a PhD process or indeed part of an academic process, is a methodological review, where we look at the methods employed invariably within a certain theoretical area. It can be qualitative, quantitative, mixed, whatever it is, a laborious process, which I don't necessarily advocate. However, as I said earlier, given that your literature review is one of the strongest structural pillars we have, your ability to inflect your work with methodological ideas, who has done what and why, and particularly methods or empirical sources that support your methodological choices, it's a great way of building that central argument, okay? So we don't want you to engage in a methodological review. We want you to highlight key contributions that have perhaps used a similar method to yours to support your work. So what most of you will be doing is something called an integrative review. This is the most common review within an academic framework, regardless of your discipline. And it is a gestalt and an amalgamation of all the other things that I have just spoken about. It is an inclusive review that takes the best bits from the other structures, so chronology, methodology, and so on, to create a more robust and far-reaching, and above all, argumentative framework for what you are doing, okay? So you will be engaging in an integrative review. So when you start to write, reflect on what I have just said in the context of methodology and understand that those elements are critically important to creating a truly readable, workable, and killer integrative review. So the characteristics of an integrative review, basically you're mapping from start to finish, looking at the various significant ideas that have permeated each time frame of what you are doing, the methodological elements. I with my students back here in the UK, I invariably use Better Call Saul. I hope there are some fans out there. Wonderful piece of American television, absolutely superb. You can't understand the end of Better Call Saul without ostensibly going back to the first series. By disseminating the first series, we have a better understanding of the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the final. Characters, data, perceptions, moments in time, all allow us to frame and map the journey of Jimmy, okay? So think of your integrative review as mapping a television series, where you have to go back to the beginning to understand what is currently happening and the end. You will cherry pick key moments to understand the journey of that particular individual. And the individual in this sense would be your research question, how we actually permeate and bring that element through, okay? And what it does, it provides focus. It provides focus for you. So the ideas you will want to integrate will form structural paragraphs that guide the reader. You have to be selective in an integrative review and understand what are the most important elements that contribute to the whole, okay? So I hope that makes sense. I'll be happy to discuss that further, but I really and sincerely hope that makes sense. But before we go on, and I sincerely hope that you do have access to a library. If not, I'm sure I can forward something to Stacey to pass on to you. In terms of writing an integrative review, this is a paper that I ask my students to read. It's a nice, straightforward takeaway from today's session. It doesn't matter that it's got anything to do with human resources. It breaks down exactly what should be in a integrative review. So if you get a chance to read that, and it's also something good to cite, if you're writing a proposal and things of that nature, I would encourage you to get that. So I hope those kind of initial elements are clear. I hope you're gleaning and benefiting from that. Hopefully I've told you something new. But before we get into the body of the work, I just want to touch upon argumentation. It's the one thing that even the best students leave out of their work because they don't know what an argument is. Your work will be a 5,000, 2,000 word evaluation of an argument centered that supports and also negates the work. Obviously, the emphasis is on support, but you have to be able to acknowledge other opinions. So an argument is not a slanging match, a screaming match between partners. It is not an ability to shout louder. It is not an ability to undercut someone. It is not an ability to bully someone. It is not an ability to actually ensure that you're saying more and more and more about the same thing. An argument is a dialectic. It is a debate where you have a point of view, you present it concisely, you present it objectively, and then you acknowledge others. So academic argumentation is not about what I believe, what I believe, what I believe. It is not ideological. There is no religiosity in academic writing. It is not about what you fundamentally believe. It is about what has been stated within fact and what has been presented in fact that underpins your work and actually then causes problems for your work. And trust me, the more that you can acknowledge argument, not to the detriment of your own, the higher your grade will be, okay? But what we want to avoid then are something called polemics. I've got some football fans, some English football fans there, okay? If you ask them who's the best football team in the world, they will tell you England. Now, I don't know if any of you are football fans, soccer fans, whatever it may be. There may be a significant argument for England being classified as the best football team in the world. But what you would have there is a one-sided, subjective evaluation of why they think they are the best team in the world, not necessarily predicated on fact or history or current rankings or the amount of World Cups won. It would be a subjective evaluation of we think it is because we think it is. You have to avoid any subjectivity in your writing unless that has been sanctioned by your mentor or your lecturer or the marker. We also want you to avoid something called hyperbole, exaggeration. Lots of students start using lots of adjectives and verbs which build up their work. Don't do it. Don't do it. Present it in the simplest, purest forms. If your argument is strong enough, you will not need to underpin it or exaggerate. And the other thing we get a lot of in terms of developing criticality is something called ad hominem. That is where you attack another person's work, you ridicule another person's work, you scream about another person's work to the detriment of your own. So you avoid any subjectivity, you avoid exaggeration when you start to write, and you fundamentally avoid attacking a piece of work. And by attacking, I have read pieces of work where work has been derided as rubbish, insincere, lacking depth. You cannot make that judgment call. And more importantly, the marker will fully understand that is not criticality. Criticality is the acknowledgement of both sides of a story, okay? But if in doubt, a simple proposition, who is the best? All of the individuals on that screen have their own, well, I suppose their own history, their own abilities, their own records of success. But depending on who you are, you would support one or another. And I presume, hopefully, there are some basketball fans within our group today. All have merit. But to decide who is best is an impossible task. You develop metrics to understand that, but you also understand other perspectives on why others, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, whoever it might be, LeBron, and so on and so forth, might be the best. You have to take that on board. It's a great exercise for developing academic argument. Find somebody passionate, listen to them, listen to their contrary viewpoints, and you'll understand that you have to remain calm and collected and acknowledge. And the same principle here then, okay? Your favorite soccer team, whatever it is, there are pros and cons for each of the teams up on the screen. Deducing who's the best would be an impossible task, but you can get a lot closer to understanding who's the best by disseminating their history, their current form, the players they have, the revenues they've created, using variables and ideas to try to create an argument and a definitive argument for supporting one or the other. But to support one or the other, you have to acknowledge the flaws in your own. So I really hope that makes sense, okay? So one thing that I'm going to start talking now about the structure of the piece of work. I'm conscious I've got only a little bit of time left, so forgive me. So the introduction to your work. So the introduction to your work is arguably the most important element. What we find with introductions is that people overload. They overload the introduction in an attempt to sway the audience. Absolutely, unequivocally the wrong way to do it. Your introduction will set the tone, you will set parameters of the research, and then you will start to comment on what the central debate is within your research question. What is the central theoretical idea and what isn't known in context? Okay, that's the idea. So do not use this as what we call theory dumping, dumping ideas into the introduction. This is the tentative beginnings of your argument. So as I put there, be cool. Don't put all of your good work into the introduction. An introduction, think of it like speed dating. You've got a few moments to actually impress someone with the breadth of what you're trying to do, some of the characteristics of the work, the major ideas involved, and then you get into the main body. Okay, so you use that to develop the depth and the argument. And I've got some key sentences you can use for that. But that's what an introduction is. That's what an introduction is. It's ingratiation. The major theoretical lens used for this is X, Y, and Z. It has been built over a series of several decades and has proven to be problematic. Subsequently, there are several thoughts and ideas and concepts that permeate a single idea. But for the purposes of this research, the conceptualization will be. And then you can get into the body. So you're introducing the main element, okay? Do not present your whole story in introduction. Again, if you're reading work, you're not going to have any issues understanding what an introduction should be. So developing a simple structure, there's a little bit of reiteration there. So what I want to do is just jump onto this. These are key phrases that I encourage my students to use in an introduction. So recent studies, prior work. So we're getting some chronology, we're getting some contemporary elements into that. And what is great, if you look at sort of element 5 there, the available literature reveals that the topic is still developing. The moment that you convey to the reader that your work, that the theories that you're looking at are still developing, your work has a place within it. Nothing is definitively ever been established within an academic framework. Okay, even if they've had 10,000 people as a sample. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean the whole world. So that notion of it's still developing, there is still much to learn, is a key consideration when you're building your argument. This research is important primarily because we don't know anything about this. Okay, that's very important. Consider that as an element of what you're doing. Every single theory, every single idea is in a process of development. That's the human condition. We learn more and more about less and less every single day. And this particular element here, this work addresses that particular need. Frame your work as a useful proposition in understanding the research question. If you don't have faith in your work, nobody else will. So hopefully those key sentences are of use to you. Take them away and implement them. So the main body of work. So go back to the funnel element, and that's Arnold Schwarzenegger, not me as a younger man. The main body of work is where we start now to bore into the major theories, okay? You will be taking an integrative work. The way to address this is to tell us what a theory is. Not descriptively, present it. It is suggested that theory A is. It has been defined and refined as. So start to build those theoretical areas using one or two direct quotes that eloquently frame the basic structures of what is to come. That's so, so important. One lesson I learned when I was doing my PhD was the sooner that you can bring in a conceptualization or a framed idea of the theories you're looking at, the better, because that's the little bit of silver guiding the reader through what we are doing, okay? So it's so, so, so important that you do that. But the element is as we progress then, we get into this notion that the theoretical ideas you have to be supported by at least two viewpoints, okay? To build your theory, build your conceptualization, frame the importance of the theory, but as we progress, we start to offer that criticality. And the next model is actually from one of my books, so how we develop a critical argument. So your central argument will be potentially Magic Johnson is the greatest basketball player that's ever played the game. I don't know if that's true. You will have your own opinions. I was a child of the 90s. I enjoyed a bit of basketball. So Magic Johnson sort of encapsulates that LA Lakers period for me. That's the central argument. I would posit the titles he's won, the money he's earned, etc., etc., etc. So I would provide evidence for that argument. Magic Johnson has won this, etc., etc. As we progress, then we have to then have a look at what we call the counter argument. The counter arguments are, well, let's have a look at Michael Jordan. What has he won? What has he earned? How many titles has he won? What endorsements does he have? That's not for you to say, well, hang on, I think he's much better. But it's important to acknowledge that while you have posited that Magic Johnson is the best basketball player, there is an acknowledged argument that others may well contribute and be the greatest of all time. But what you do then, you would then have your rebuttal. So argument, counter argument, and rebuttal. And rebuttal within the major body of the piece of work is a reinforcing of why potentially you think Magic Johnson is the greatest basketball player. He was one of the first, he was iconic, he was zeitgeist, took that team to multiple titles, the first of his kind, iconic, iconoclastic, whatever you want to do, okay? So that's how we do it. I believe, well, the work supports this. You have what we call your however moment. Others believe this, but ultimately in the context of this research, this is what's being posited. This is what's being posited. The rebuttal is so important. Invariably, students only concentrate on evidence for their argument, completely miss out the counter argument, or actually give it a wide berth in the context of it has 2 or 3 sentences or even a paragraph, and then the rebuttal doesn't exist. What we want from you is your ability to have that metacognitive ability to show that you've read, you understand the variables involved with your argument, and those which do not support. You will have more marks for actually accrediting those who do not support what you do than something descriptive that fundamentally supports your research question. It just becomes a polemic, and if you go back to my previous slides, we don't want. Okay, so we are narrowing as we go through the body. You've got your major conceptualizations, then we start to narrow, and then we are looking at critique. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this particular slide, and I know we're running out of time. But the basic format is you express your rationale, you categorize and create your central argument, you provide empirical evidence for your central argument, that is fact that supports your argument. You then acknowledge the counter argument or the opposition, and you do provide fact for that. You use empirics to underpin that as well, and then we have your rebuttal. Unless you are conforming to this particular kind of argument or arrangement, you're going to have a significant problem. You are ceasing to engage in a critical evaluation. It'll be detrimental to your mark, detrimental to your graduation. So please, 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 if you're going to download this, come back to this major point and the elements of argumentation in it, okay? So what we want then, and I think it's, I've used Maverick, I think Mr. Cruz up from us. So what we want is for you to be ultra selective. You cannot, by definition, provide every piece of empiricism to support your argument. It's impossible. Get the major empirical elements that support that. Get the major data contributors to do that, okay? Only use authoritative work. Only use peer-assessed works. Don't use blogs and polemics. So find out who the major 5 to 10 academics are in your area, and their work will form the basis of potentially your central argument, okay? But don't be afraid to concentrate on a handful of contributions. Good contributions will ultimately demonstrate a breadth of reading, will demonstrate knowledge, but that's okay. But trying to establish the limitations of what's known, okay? Always, always, always come back to the point that we are learning constantly, and that's how you frame your research question into that major area, okay? So very much like I did before, these are some key phrases that you'd be really useful in terms of introducing ideas and concepts into your work. So I hope you find these useful. So, for example, previous studies have failed to explore. All of these support your work. They support your work. And there are sentences in there, several excellent qualitative undertakings have appeared in the literature. That can build your methodology, okay? The Jones and Jones failed to fully account for the use of a student sample. That's critical. That's a critical sentence. That's how you introduce criticality, okay? So take some of these elements away, some of these sentences, and start to implement them. And what you will find, you're quickly developing a strong paragraph or sets of paragraphs. And again, we have another set of examples of that for how useful phrases for narrowing your body, okay? The moment you say major studies in a sentence, you can cite them. It demonstrates a breadth of reading. So by using these sentences, not only to create structure, but you use them also to create some of the basic elements that you have. That is a breadth of reading, okay? Again, I won't dwell on too much because I am conscious I'm going to run over time, so forgive me. But these are the common mistakes then, okay? Review isn't focused, a killer. You must focus by having theory and building chronologically and historically, you will have that, okay? The review isn't written in the author's words. Everything that you will want to write has probably been written before and written very, very eloquently. The temptation will be to borrow that and utilize it for your own work. Don't. Learn the paraphrase. Putting it into your own voice, your own timbre will be so advantageous when it comes to your marks, okay? Absolutely unequivocal. And always cite. You'll be surprised when you start to write a piece of work that you forget to acknowledge your sources. Please do so. Otherwise, you'll be in a world of trouble. So the conclusion, what we really want here then is to reinforce the summation of the major drivers of your work. It's a great chance then to reiterate your research question and actually just frame the major selling point of that. And it's a chance to reconnect the reader with your work and the relevance. So it's very, very simple. Don't introduce anything new. There is no need for any new theoretical concept in here. It is a couple of paragraph summation that leads into the methodology. What I have got here, again, is some key phrases for you to take away from today to support your research. And one key thing, one of the key sentences there is the review's purpose has been to reiterate your central argument within that final framework, okay? So a conclusion is actually a lot harder than you think because this is the last bit. How do I make it profound? How do I make it scintillating? How do I engage the reader? If you've written well in the first element, you've engaged the reader. This is just think of it as the reiteration or the rebuttal again of your central argument. So important to do that, okay? So some of the mistakes that people make when writing a conclusion, don't introduce anything new. No new theories, no new authors, no new concepts, okay? Don't raise any additional questions beyond your research question. That's a killer. Please don't do it. And actually don't use the word summary, okay? Because it's almost colloquial, it's not particularly academic, okay? And one mistake that I see a lot is that people draw conclusions from their work. It's impossible to draw a significant conclusion from a literature review because you've got two central arguments. You've got your central and your counter arguments, which is physically impossible for you to arrive then at a point where you can say definitively, this is fact, okay? So don't do that, and please avoid these elements. So again, when you're writing your conclusion, just go back to this. So I just want to touch upon plagiarism very, very quickly with the few minutes we have left. I'm sure you all know what plagiarism is, but it's so tempting to engage and not to acknowledge authors, even to use ghostwriters and poor citing. Just reflect on this. It's very easy for us as academics to understand plagiarism, regardless of the fact now that AI can write essays for you. It's still very easy to spot if it isn't a student's work. Remember, we spend time with you. We know your writing style, we know your lexicon, we know your idioms, your idiosyncratic nature for writing. So it's so important that you don't take shortcuts. So one of the key things for this to avoid plagiarism is really to start paraphrasing. It's one of the key skills. So we go back to the beginning, start using those Cornell notes as often as you can to try and develop this structure. And my final slide then, and I suppose my top tip, as soon as you can, start writing. If you've got any kind of neuroses about the literature review, the moment you start to put words on paper, all of that neuroses goes away. I don't say that as an academic trying to placate you. It is a statement of fact, okay? An absolute statement of fact. So write as soon as you can, even if it's with a Cornell note-taking, please write, and you will go a long way to ensuring that you're successful. And write freely. One of the things with literature reviews, people get bound up in word counts. So write freely. It's a lot easier to edit a literature review after that to make sure that you get the right draft. And remember, your first draft will not be your final draft, okay? So I shall stop there because we're running out of time. I hope I've been able to touch upon some salient points and give you some ideas to move forward. And thank you very much for your patience.
No, that was great, Dr. Thomas. Great. We have a lot of questions, a lot of positive comments about all the content that you shared. Very, very,
That's
very
very kind.
helpful. I'm just going to share my screen real quick, and then we'll go to questions. So I just want to remind people we have more of these webinars in the series, both for qualitative mixed methods and for writing. I put a link in the chat, so feel free to share it and register. So this was presented by Citavi. That's one of our products. That's a reference management and writing solution. It integrates with NVivo very nicely. And if you are using other reference management software, you can still import those projects into Citavi, so you don't have to start from scratch. So check it out. We have the link in the PowerPoint that we shared. Just more of our solutions here. So you have that too in the PowerPoint. And lastly, we'd love for you to join our community. This allows us to send you a newsletter and let you know about upcoming webinars like this one, and also user groups and a podcast. So feel free to do that too. I'll put that link in a second. But now I'll go to questions, and I'll stop sharing. So questions. So one question, which I think people, I know as a student, I had this, was, could you discuss tips for how to decide when you have reached a point of saturation so as not to get overwhelmed? New studies in my area seem to be published every other month.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. And if you are working in an academic world, you get lots of academics who are theory building, taking small ideas and it extrapolating. You won't have to kind of get into that nuance. What you will find in terms of a point of saturation is that in terms of your argument, there are probably half a dozen papers that really make salient points. The rest are just building on those. So when I tell my students, right, how do I get the most out of this so I'm not going down to rabbit holes and I'm ensuring that I'm not endlessly reading. It is really to find the most salient papers. One thing to do, firstly, get a blank piece of paper. After your first reading, start writing down keywords from that paper. Start writing down key authors. Okay, so that's about as simple as I can make it at this juncture. Every couple of weeks, put that into the system to see if there's anything new, but keep coming back to the major players. If you keep coming back to the major players, you'll see others who have used their work, and you're able then to layer that on top. But so that's an easy way of not having to read everything under the sun. I've never read everything under the sun. I never will. It is a physically impossible and emotionally draining and psychologically damaging thing to do. That is not an advocacy, okay? So get your keywords, your key searches. And what you will find is when you're doing that, you'll see that invariably the papers that you're looking at are making the same contribution that you're ultimately going to make. So once you've got about 10 to 15 good, solid citations, you are then by definition reaching a saturation point. There is nowhere else to go. You've got a limited word count. So if you've got a chronological element, some historical and contemporary readings that support what you're doing, you are fundamentally in business. Okay, you are absolutely unequivocally in business. That's what we're looking for. We're not looking for an endless proposition. Okay, so that's the point of saturation. You've got strong a dozen conceptual papers that can support what you're doing. That's the point of saturation. It's not like data that people are saying. It's a little like data when people start saying the same things. Right, stop, because all you're doing then is repeating the same advocacy. Get the major players, get some of the subordinates, and that's how you will bring that element in.
Great, thank you. We've had a few questions on this topic. Kindly guide us on how to incorporate a theoretical framework in lit review section, and why should a good review have this framework?
So from an academic perspective, everything that we're looking to explore essentially comes from a theoretical basis. That's what we're doing. We take somebody else's idea and we explore it. So that idea that to create a theoretical framework, one of the first things to do is, right, what is the major idea that has driven the academic framework for 2023? Okay, so you go back to the beginning. You go back to the beginning to understand someone's existence, their life, their attitudes, their vices, their peccadillos, whatever it might be. You go back to the beginning and try to start to understand them. So by going back to the beginning, you get your first major theoretical structural block. And then the theoretical framework then is how you map out how that theory is developed within the context of your research question. That's what you're doing. So again, I come back to my central point. The theoretical framework that you have to implement already exists. If you, whatever your topic is, do this if you have a chance. Whatever your topic is, use a peer-assessed journal, find the most recent contemporary piece of work in your area, have a look at the literature review, and that's the theoretical framework. They start at the beginning, they look at who has contributed and what has ensured that they've reached a point today where we need to know more. So that's how you do it. It's linear. It is linear. That's how you develop a theoretical framework. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I would be happy for any of you to contact me on LinkedIn if you wanted me to answer these questions a little more fully, whatever. But that's how you develop a theoretical framework. As I've said, your first paragraph is a broad overview, then you start narrowing down into the contributions that support what you are doing. That's a theoretical framework. That's what it is. If I'm writing, if I want to write about why do people buy Omega watches, okay, my first theoretical framework would be to look at the broadness of consumer behavior and decision making, and then I'm narrowing that down. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I really do.
Thank you.
And I think I can just see a question there: how to select literature for a review. So keywords, going back to the point I made earlier, keyword searches are absolutely essential. Go to the journals, put in your keyword searches. Anything that contains that word will come up. There is nothing complicated about that. And you can find dozens and dozens of articles in one sitting, and that will mitigate for a lot of neuroses, trust me. It's what I do when I write.
Good advice. I have one more, we could take one more question. We had a few about, is it ethical to use paraphrasing to using like a Quillbot, like something like you talked about AI, and you sort of mentioned that already, but we've had a few questions.
Avoid. Okay, you're going to end up in an awful lot of trouble because you won't know the work. So regrettably, we kind of go back to the dawn of time, pen and paper. Okay, or let's be honest, an Apple Mac or whatever you have in front of you. The more that you develop a schematic for synthesizing the work, honestly, the easier it becomes. It's like muscle memory. You'll see a paragraph, you go, right, I know what the keywords are. And it's a beautiful way of writing because it's your way of writing. And I can guarantee you, if you can convey some of your natural characteristics in your writing style and idiosyncratic, we are going to enjoy reading it. Believe it or not, as academics, we enjoy reading our students' work. Because whether you may not know is we are on a bit of a journey with you. Okay, and that's the fact. So yeah, please avoid ghostwriting. Don't. I cannot stress that enough. Okay, please don't.
Very good. So I want to thank you, Dr. Thomas, for presenting today. It was great. And
My pleasure.
So everyone knows you'll get the recording and the PowerPoint handout if you couldn't download it probably early next week sometime. But thanks everyone for joining us, and hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me. Good luck to all of you. And again, please feel free to connect on LinkedIn or whatever you want to do.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.